Okay.
Now, you just gave a speech, the keynote address at the Footprint Forum 2010 here in near Siena in Italy, and you talked about the need to change the cultural narrative. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on that a little bit? What did you mean by that?
Well, Carl, you ask such simple little questions that are hard to answer in a brief period of time. Every culture, whether it's conscious of it or not, has a narrative. There's always an origin story. Where did we come from? There's always a destination story. Where are we going? And then there's all the little stories in between that describe that culture's relationship to other societies, to nature, to each other within the culture. That's what we mean by the cultural narrative. It's the combined mythology of a particular culture. Now, these differ between societies, but every culture has one. So there's an inherent quality in human beings that requires a story to make sense of the world. So we have a cultural narrative. And for the last couple of 100 years, it's been based on the idea of, for example, unlimited economic growth. A part of it is that everyone benefits regardless of how high your income is. You continue to benefit as your income is increased. We recognize that the material world is under our control, or at least we seem to think of it. So we have this image of man. It's based on, we call it the progress myth sometimes, or the myth of perpetual economic growth, that is a principal plank in the platform of our economic portion of our cultural narrative. So this is a narrative which was not harmful 150 or 200 years ago, because the scale, the sheer size of the human enterprise was tiny relative to the capacity of the ecosphere. But the power of that narrative is such that we've expanded populations by 5-fold since it took off. Economic production is up perhaps 40-fold in that period. Energy consumption by a factor of 16. Fisheries consumption by a factor of 35. But of course, energy stocks are declining. Fish stocks have never increased as the impact increased. So our cultural narrative is dissonant with the nature of the reality within which it is embedded. We've now reached the scale, the sheer size of the human enterprise is such that continuing to believe in a narrative where perpetual growth in material well-being is deemed to be desirable and possible is simply not possible within a real ecosphere that is fixed in scale and limited in its production. So there's nothing wrong with humans as consumers, but we have to learn to consume within the productive capacity and the assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. Rewriting the cultural narrative, then, requires abandonment of the myth of perpetual material growth. Now, in theory, you could have income growth continuing, but we can't have material and energy throughputs continuing to grow on a finite planet. It means shifting, as in the last 40 or 50 years, part of our narrative has moved toward individualism, towards selfishness. In fact, one can see many business people arguing that it's selfishness that makes the world go round, and the more selfish you are and the bigger you create your firm, it's better for all of us. It's this hidden hand argument taken to kind of an absurd extreme. The reality is that that's got to go as well, that we have to recognize that selfishness and individualism, the breakdown in community, all of these things are counterproductive in an era where we see increasing resource scarcity, that these are resources upon which we all depend, and it becomes quite clear that we need to see our individual self-interest in terms of our collective interest in conserving the ecosphere. So in a word, it's a revision of our cultural narrative away from growth and selfish short-term self-interest toward a steady state economy in which we recognize that our collective and tribal interests are now most closely associated with the collective interest of the whole human family, and that we can't go it alone. No country can be sustainable on its own. No country can break from the world community in ways that will resolve its sustainability to the limit if the rest of the world community continues down the present pathway. So we now have a collective problem that needs to be solved by the world community together, either through the UN or new agencies that regulate our interaction with nature. It's never been done before, it's never been required before, so nobody's to blame here. It's just that the circumstances of the human enterprise have so changed that we need a new narrative to regulate it.
Thank you. Now, the Trust for Sustainable Living, which I run in the UK, we're interested in how behavior might shift on an individual and a family and a community level. How do you see the adoption of sustainable living, for want of a better word, playing itself out as this narrative changes?
Well, that's a very pertinent question. In fact, there's some risk here in that in many countries, governments have tended to offload this problem onto the individual, so that we're encouraged to, change our light bulbs or drive our car less one day a week or shower with a friend. There's all of these individual kinds of techniques. But we frankly know that they don't make that much difference. Perhaps if everyone did everything they could at the individual level, we'd save 15 or 20% at most of our energy and material throughputs. So it becomes, again, something of a collective problem. The heavy lifting solutions have to be implemented by governments on behalf of all of us. So we need, for example, carbon taxation or cap-and-trade systems. We need investment in public transit as opposed to the investment in private capital in the form of billions of automobiles. That money should be redirected toward the creation of better transit systems so nobody needs a car. But individuals can't do that. As an individual, I can't put in the carbon trading system or the cap and trade or the carbon tax. I can't implement the better transit system. So there has to be a combination of individual actions and government actions on behalf of individuals who want to do the right thing. Frankly, it's absurd in a city to have automobiles as the principal mode of transportation. It's wasteful of resources, it's clearly contributing to the climate problem, and urban transportation would be much better served by public vehicles of one kind or another. The air improves, the nature of the whole urban system would improve. That said, let's be clear here. Individuals are going to have to go through very significant changes. If we take the UK, the current per capita footprint is about 5.5 global average hectares. If we were a completely equitable world, each individual in the UK would be entitled to, shall we say, 2 global hectares. On planet Earth right now, if you divide the total productive landscape and waterscape by the number of people, you're entitled to the productivity and assimilative capacity of no more than 2 hectares. Well, if you're currently living an average lifestyle that requires 5, then quite clearly, on an equitable planet living within its ecological means, the UK will have to reduce its total throughput by over 50%. In North America, it's over 80% because we have much larger footprints. Now, those sound like daunting numbers, but there's 2 things in our favor. We have the technology now off the shelf to achieve certainly a 50% reduction in energy and material use in many, many domains with no change whatsoever. In fact, an improvement in the quality of life. But the incentives aren't in the marketplace to bring those technologies into play, which is where full cost pricing comes into play, which can only be brought about by, for example, ecological tax reform, something governments have to do on behalf of the collective. So again, people will have to go through a shift in the nature of the technologies that they use, in the lifestyles that they live, but they can't do it alone. This is something governments have to help us through. And these are big steps, but they are within our capacity should we choose to take them. The danger is that we keep delaying, that people are afraid of the idea of shrinking. Why would you be afraid of shrinking if you're actually better off in terms of cleaner technologies, more efficient appliances, better insulated better insulated homes, much more fuel efficient vehicles, and so on and so forth? That makes us better off, not worse off, even though your consumption is reduced by 50 or even 80%. We can achieve that. We can't do it alone. This becomes then a massive global enterprise to get us through this crisis.
So governments really need to take the lead, and then we can create the space into which we can follow.
That's precisely right. I think the population has to recognize they can only do so much as individuals, as families, but the heavy lifting has to be done by policies implemented on our behalf, on behalf of the popular interest by our governments. Pardon me, both nationally and in the international arena.
Professor Rees, any final words, any final thoughts?
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interview.